Right now, somewhere on this planet, a kettle is boiling. In the next 60 seconds, roughly 3 million cups of tea will be poured, sipped and swallowed without a second thought. By the time you finish watching this video, the world will have consumed more tea than any other liquid except water itself. 2 billion cups a day. Every day. That makes tea the most popular manufactured beverage in human history, more consumed than coffee, soda, and beer combined. But here is the question nobody asks while they are dunking a bag into a mug at their kitchen counter. How did a handful of bitter leaves boiled in water become the fuel behind empires, the trigger for wars, the currency of colonial exploitation, and one of the most addictive habits on earth? Because that cup in your hand did not arrive innocently. It arrived soaked in blood, smuggled through opium dens, stolen by industrial spies, and marketed by governments desperate to control how their citizens thought, worked, and rebelled. We are going to trace tea from a mythical accident in an ancient emperor's garden to the gunboats that shelled Chinese ports to force it into foreign hands. We are going to meet a Scottish botanist who disguised himself to smuggle tea plants out of China under penalty of death. A Chinese commissioner who tried to burn 20,000 chests of opium to stop a war he could see coming. And marketing men who convinced entire nations that stopping work twice a day to drink hot leaf water was a patriotic duty. Along the way, we will bust a few cherished legends, because as with most everyday objects, the official story of tea is mostly polish over something far stranger and considerably more violent. There is a reason this small leaf became entangled with imperial trade deficits, addiction, and outright war, and understanding why means going back nearly 5,000 years to a legend involving a Chinese emperor, a gust of wind, and a leaf that supposedly fell into his cup by accident. Whether that story is even true is another matter entirely, and we will get to that. But first, understand this: nothing about tea's rise to global dominance was gentle, natural, or accidental. Every stage of its journey, from ritual to religion, from commerce to conquest, was pushed forward by someone with something to gain. Farmers, monks, merchants, spies, soldiers, and marketing executives all left fingerprints on the beverage sitting in your cup right now. So the next time someone tells you tea is simply relaxing, remember that you are holding one of the most consequential commodities in the history of human civilization, and its story starts not with comfort, but with myth. Legend places the discovery of tea in the garden of a mythical ruler known as the Divine Farmer, a figure Chinese tradition credits with teaching humanity agriculture and medicine. The story goes like this. The emperor, a meticulous man obsessed with health, insisted that all his drinking water be boiled first, a habit that alone probably saved more lives than most ancient medicine combined. One afternoon, resting beneath a wild tree, a breeze shook loose a handful of leaves that drifted down into his pot of boiling water. Rather than discard the now discolored liquid, the emperor, ever the experimenter, tasted it. He found it bitter, fragrant, and strangely invigorating, and declared that the plant had revealed itself to him as a gift. Just like that, according to legend, tea was born, not through careful cultivation or trial and error, but through pure cosmic accident, gifted to humanity by a ruler so wise the universe itself decided to hand him a beverage worth billions of dollars annually. It is a wonderful story. It is also almost certainly untrue, or at the very least, wildly oversimplified. The Divine Farmer himself is a legendary culture hero rather than a documented historical person, someone later dynasties invoked retroactively to give ancient practices a sense of divine sanction and unbroken lineage. Attaching tea's origin to him was not really about explaining a beverage. It was about giving an already established practice an impressive pedigree. The ancient equivalent of a startup claiming its founder was personally mentored by a genius, whether or not that mentorship ever happened. What the archaeological and botanical record actually suggests is far less magical and far more interesting. Long before anyone was steeping leaves for pleasure, tea plants were almost certainly used as medicine, chewed or brewed for their stimulant and purported healing properties, deployed by early healers the way countless other bitter bioactive plants were deployed throughout the ancient world. This was not romance. This was pharmacology, centuries before anyone had a word for pharmacology. Communities in what is now southwestern China lived among wild tea plants and had every practical reason to experiment with them, the same way humans have always experimented with unfamiliar flora, cautiously, empirically, and out of necessity. Tea's earliest identity, in other words, was not a drink at all in the way we would recognize it. It was a tonic, a remedy, a substance handled with the same seriousness as any other medicinal herb, something you were given when you were sick, not something you sipped for comfort on a rainy afternoon. The pleasant, ritualized version of tea drinking that later cultures would elevate into ceremony came only after generations of accumulated practical knowledge about the plant's effects, knowledge that had nothing to do with emperors or gusts of wind and everything to do with trial, error, and survival. This distinction matters enormously because it tells us something the legend conveniently obscures. Tea did not begin as a luxury or a symbol of refinement. It began as medicine, controlled and administered with purpose, which meant that from its very first appearance in the historical record, tea was already entangled with power, knowledge, and control over who got access to it. That entanglement would only deepen from here. If the divine farmer story sounds too tidy to be true, wait until you hear the one about the eyelids. This legend belongs not to the misty prehistory of Chinese agriculture, but to the world of Zen Buddhism, and it stars a 5th-century Indian monk named Bodhidharma, traditionally credited as the founder of Chan Buddhism, the tradition that would later travel to Japan and become Zen. According to the story, Bodhidharma vowed to meditate for 9 consecutive years without ever closing his eyes, a superhuman feat of discipline meant to prove the seriousness of his devotion. Partway through, exhausted and betrayed by his own body, he fell asleep. Furious at his weakness, he is said to have torn off his own eyelids and flung them to the ground so that sleep could never again violate his vow. Where the eyelids landed, tea bushes sprang up, gifting humanity a plant whose leaves, when steeped, could keep the mind alert and the eyes wide open forever after. It is a vivid, gruesome, unforgettable story, exactly the kind of tale that spreads well precisely because it is too strange to forget. And like most stories that are too good to be true, it is not. The problem starts with timing. Bodhidharma, if he existed as described, lived and taught in the 5th or 6th century, say. The eyelid legend, however, does not appear in any surviving text until many centuries later, showing up in written form only during the Song dynasty and after, roughly 600 to 800 years following his supposed lifetime. That is an enormous gap for an oral tradition to survive untouched, and historians of Chinese Buddhism generally treat the tale not as remembered history, but as invented hagiography, a category of religious literature designed to build the reputation and mystique of a revered founder retroactively. Monastic communities had every incentive to manufacture such stories. By the time the legend was being written down, tea drinking was already deeply embedded in monastic life across China, used by monks to stay awake through long stretches of seated meditation. Tying that already established practice to the founder of their entire lineage gave tea a sacred origin story that flattered Buddhist tradition, reinforced monastic discipline as the source of a beloved cultural practice, and conveniently ignored the far more mundane truth that monks, like everyone else, had simply inherited tea-drinking habits from the surrounding agricultural and medicinal traditions that predated Buddhism's arrival in China entirely. In other words, the legend was propaganda, in the literal sense of material, designed to propagate a faith's prestige, not a factual record of botanical origin. This pattern, incidentally, should start to feel familiar. Just as the divine farmer myth retroactively assigned a heroic, single-moment origin to what was really centuries of slow medicinal experimentation, the Bodhidharma legend retroactively assigned a sacred, single-figure origin to what was really the gradual adoption of a useful stimulant by a religious community that badly wanted a good story. Tea, it turns out, has never lacked for people eager to claim credit for it, or institutions eager to wrap it in myth. What actually happened next was far less poetic and far more consequential. Tea stopped being confined to temples and medicine cabinets and started becoming something that could be grown, taxed, transported, and sold. By the 7th century, China had entered the Tang dynasty, an era of imperial consolidation, urban prosperity, and, crucially, infrastructure. Roads connected provinces. Canals moved grain. And along these arteries of empire, tea began its transformation from a monk's private discipline into a nationwide commodity. This shift needed a champion, and it found one in a man named Lu Yu. Orphaned as an infant and raised by Buddhist monks in a monastery, Lu Yu grew up surrounded by the very ritual tea culture the previous section just finished debunking as myth. But rather than mystify tea further, Lu Yu did something almost radical for his time. He systematized it. Around 760 CE, he wrote the Jing, or the Classic of Tea, the world's first comprehensive manual dedicated entirely to the plant. It covered everything: how to cultivate the bushes, how to pick the leaves, how to process, brew, and even properly drink the resulting liquid, down to the shape of the ideal cup. Think about that for a second. This was not a poem or a prayer. It was a technical manual, and an extraordinarily influential one. The Jing effectively took tea out of the exclusive hands of monks and physicians and handed it to merchants, officials, and eventually ordinary households as a codified, teachable practice. Lu Yu did not invent tea culture, but he standardized it, and standardization is what makes something scalable. Once you can teach a process, you can replicate it. Once you can replicate it, you can sell it. And once you can sell it, an entrepreneurial empire will find a way to move it. The Tang state noticed quickly. By 793 CE, the imperial government had implemented a formal tax on tea, an unmistakable signal that tea had graduated from spiritual practice to serious economic asset worth the state's attention. Where there is a tax, there is a trade network robust enough to be worth taxing, and teas had grown substantial. Merchants organized caravans carrying compressed tea bricks, dense, portable, nearly indestructible pucks of processed leaf that traveled far better than loose tea ever could across long overland routes. These bricks were not just convenient. They were practically currency in some regions, used to barter for horses, salt, and other goods along frontier trade routes. Tea was leaving China. It moved along the trade corridors radiating outward from Tang territory, carried by merchants whose names history did not bother to record, unlike Lu Yu's. It reached Tibet, where it became a dietary staple mixed with yak butter and salt. It reached Mongolia and beyond, integrating into cultures that had no prior tea tradition whatsoever, adapting to local tastes as it spread, rather than staying frozen in its Chinese form. This is the pattern worth noticing. Tea's global journey did not begin with European ships or colonial ambition. It began centuries earlier, propelled by Chinese imperial taxation, merchant enterprise, and a scholar orphan's obsessive manual on how to brew a proper cup. The ritual had become an industry, and the industry was about to go international in ways nobody in Tang China could have anticipated. Because while Lu Yu was cataloguing brewing techniques and tax collectors were counting bricks of compressed leaf, tea was quietly beginning a journey that would eventually put it on ships bound for ports thousands of miles away, into the hands of people who spoke no Chinese at all, and who would soon become far more obsessed with it than anyone in its homeland could have predicted. Fast forward nearly 1,000 years, and tea arrives in England as an exotic curiosity, a strange dried leaf sold in coffee houses to the curious and the wealthy, marketed as a cure for everything from headaches to melancholy. Nobody in London in the mid-1600s could have predicted what came next. Within 100 years, tea stopped being a curiosity and became a national compulsion. It seeped into every layer of British society, from aristocratic drawing rooms to labourers' cottages, until the ritual of the tea break was as woven into daily British life as the weather itself. And here is the part the shortbread tins and porcelain sets do not advertise. Britain grew almost none of this tea itself. Every single leaf had to be imported from China, the only major tea-producing region in the world at that time, which meant that Britain's growing addiction came with a growing bill. And China, notably, did not want British goods in return. The Qing court had little interest in wool, in tin, in the manufactured trinkets Britain tried to offer as trade goods. China wanted one thing only: silver, hard, physical, gleaming silver bullion, paid up front, no substitutions accepted. So as British demand for tea climbed year after year, decade after decade, so did the outflow of silver from British coffers into Chinese treasuries. This was not a minor accounting inconvenience. This was a structural hemorrhage. Historians estimate that, by the late 1700s, Britain was sending staggering quantities of silver to China annually just to keep the tea flowing. A trade imbalance so severe it threatened to destabilize the British economy itself. Imagine an entire empire, one that prided itself on global dominance and commercial supremacy, quietly bleeding out its treasury because its population could not go a single afternoon without a hot cup of leaves steeped in water. That is not hyperbole. That is the ledger. And the institution tasked with fixing this problem, with finding some way to stop the silver drain without stopping the tea, was the trading company that held a royal monopoly on British commerce with Asia. Think of this company less as a corporation in the modern sense, and more as a semi-sovereign entity, with its own armies, its own diplomatic maneuvering, and its own ruthless calculus for solving problems that threatened its profits. And this problem was existential. Tea was by far its single most lucrative commodity, the product British consumers could not live without, and yet every ship that returned from Canton loaded with tea chests represented another wave of silver leaving British shores permanently. The company's directors did not see this as an ethical puzzle. They saw it as a logistics problem, awaiting a ruthless solution. They needed something, anything, that Chinese consumers would want badly enough to pay for in silver, reversing the flow, refilling the coffers that tea kept draining. And they found it. Not in wool, not in manufactured goods, not in any legitimate commodity at all. They found it in a narcotic. What happened next would drag two empires into war, addict millions of people on two continents, and forever tie the innocent teacup to one of the darkest chapters in the history of global trade. The commodity was opium, grown in the poppy fields of British-controlled Bengal, processed into hardened balls of resin, and shipped east in wooden chests stamped with the company's markings. The company itself avoided directly touching Chinese soil with the drug, since importing opium was illegal under Qing law. Instead, it auctioned the chests to independent traders in Calcutta, who carried the risk of smuggling the product into China while the company's hands remained, on paper, clean. This was laundering on an imperial scale, dressed up as free enterprise. The traders sailed for the southern coast, unloaded their cargo onto fast, heavily armed clipper ships built for evasion rather than trade, and sold the opium to Chinese middlemen, who moved it inland through networks of bribed officials and willing smugglers. The silver that had been flowing out of Britain to pay for tea now reversed course entirely, flooding back in as Chinese buyers paid for their opium in the same bullion the company had been bleeding for a century. It was, from a purely financial standpoint, an elegant solution. It was also a catastrophe unfolding in slow motion across an entire society. Addiction spread through Chinese port cities and then inland, climbing through every social class, from dock workers to imperial officials, until opium dens became a fixture of daily life in Canton and beyond. Millions of people became dependent on a substance that produced nothing, built nothing, and fed nothing back into the economy except the pockets of foreign traders and the silver reserves of a foreign company. The Qing court watched this unfold with mounting alarm, and in 1839 the emperor dispatched a formidable and famously incorruptible official to the southern coast to put an end to it. His name was Lin Sexu, a scholar bureaucrat with a reputation for discipline and moral seriousness that bordered on the theatrical. Lin arrived in Canton, surrounded foreign trading warehouses, confiscated more than 20,000 chests of opium, and destroyed the entire stockpile in a public spectacle, dissolving the drug in pits of water, lime, and salt before flushing it into the sea. He even wrote a now famous letter appealing directly to the British monarch's own moral conscience, asking how a civilized nation could profit from poisoning another. It was a bold, principled stand. It was also completely futile. Britain did not respond with moral reflection. It responded with warships. The destruction of that opium was treated not as a justified enforcement of Chinese law, but as an attack on British property and British trade interests, and it became the spark that ignited the First Opium War, a conflict that would end with China forced into humiliating concessions, its ports pried open, and its sovereignty over its own trade policy shattered for a century. Before we go further into how that war reshaped the tea trade itself, this is a good moment to hit subscribe if you're finding this rabbit hole as unsettling as we are. Because the story only gets stranger from here, moving from gunboats and treaty ports into outright botanical theft, disguised espionage, and the brutal plantation economy that would eventually make the teacup in your kitchen possible in the first place. Britain won the war, but it had not solved its problem. Opium had reversed the flow of silver, yet the East India Company remained dependent on China for the one commodity its entire empire of tea drinkers could not live without. Every pound of tea in every British teapot still came from Chinese soil, grown under Chinese methods that Chinese growers guarded as trade secrets. And that dependency was, to the company's directors, an intolerable vulnerability. If China could restrict, tax, or someday simply refuse to sell, the entire British tea economy would collapse overnight. So the company decided to stop buying the secret and start stealing it. The man they chose for the job was Robert Fortune, a Scottish botanist with a talent for collecting plants and an even greater talent for disguise. In the early 1850s, Fortune shaved his head, dressed in the robes of a Chinese mandarin, and traveled deep into regions of China closed to foreigners, posing as a merchant while he quietly gathered what no Westerner had ever been permitted to see. He toured tea factories, recorded processing techniques step by step, and hired trained Chinese tea workers to travel with him, effectively smuggling out not just the plant, but the human expertise required to grow and process it. By the time he was finished, Fortune had shipped tens of thousands of tea plants and seedlings out of China, along with the workers who knew how to turn leaf into product. It was, by any modern definition, industrial espionage on a staggering scale, carried out not by a rogue agent, but with the direct backing of a state-sanctioned monopoly. And it worked. The stolen plants were transplanted into the hills of Assam, in northeastern India, a region where a native variety of the tea plant had already been discovered growing wild, but where British planters had lacked the processing knowledge to exploit it. Now they had both the imported expertise and the local raw material, and the Assam tea industry exploded almost overnight, transforming from a curiosity into a plantation empire covering hundreds of thousands of acres within a few decades. But that empire needed hands, and it needed them cheap. The British solution was an indenture system that recruited, and often deceived, labourers from across India, promising wages and conditions that rarely matched reality once contracts were signed. Workers were transported to remote plantation districts, housed in crowded barracks, and bound to multi-year contracts that criminalized quitting, effectively transforming voluntary labor into something perilously close to bonded servitude. Mortality rates on some plantations during the early recruitment decades were horrific, with disease, malnutrition, and grueling working hours cutting through the workforce, while wages remained fixed at levels planters, not laborers, decided upon. The tea garden, that pastoral image of neat green rows stretching across misty hills, was in reality one of the most tightly controlled labor regimes of the industrial age, and the fortunes it generated flowed almost entirely upward into shipping companies, trading houses, and the drawing rooms of British tea merchants who never once had to see the hands that plucked their leaves. Tea had begun as a monk's ritual, become a merchant's commodity. And now, through theft and coerced labor, it had become an industrial machine. What it needed next was a story to make all of that disappear from the public imagination entirely. Every industry built on hidden suffering eventually needs a myth to cover its tracks, and tea's myth arrived in the form of the tea break. British companies and cultural institutions spent the better part of a century transforming a plantation commodity harvested by bonded labourers into a symbol of national character, decency, and quiet resilience. The phrase, "keep calm and carry on," though it belongs to a slightly later moment, captures the mood tea marketing cultivated deliberately, the idea that a hot cup of tea was not a colonial product, but a British birthright, a small ceremony of composure in the face of hardship. Wartime propaganda leaned into this hard. During periods of national strain, tea was rationed, distributed to factory workers and soldiers, and framed by government messaging as essential to morale, practically a weapon of endurance rather than a beverage. Advertisements showed tea steadying nerves during air raids, fueling munitions workers through night shifts, and comforting families in bomb shelters. Notice the sleight of hand, a product whose supply chain ran through stolen Chinese cultivars, Assam plantations, and indentured labor contracts, was rebranded, successfully, as the very essence of British steadiness. Across the Atlantic, a different but equally symbolic transformation was underway. Americans had turned tea into a protest icon during their revolutionary period, dumping chests of it into a harbor as a stand against taxation without representation, and that single dramatic act calcified into national mythology. Tea as the enemy of tyranny, coffee as the drink of patriots. Two nations, two entirely opposite symbolic uses for the same leaf, both convenient fictions layered over the same brutal supply chain, neither particularly wanted examined. Marketing, it turns out, is not just about selling a product. It is about deciding what a product is allowed to mean. And for over a century, what tea was allowed to mean had almost nothing to do with how it was actually produced. But myths built to obscure exploitation tend to attract people determined to expose it, and tea's industrial supply chain had far more than labor abuse to hide. Throughout the growth of mass tea commerce, unscrupulous merchants routinely adulterated cheap tea leaves with used tea leaves that had already been brewed and dried, or bulked out product with leaves from entirely different plants, sometimes colored with dyes and additives to mimic the appearance of genuine high-grade tea. Consumers had no reliable way to know what they were drinking, and reports of contaminated, low-quality, or outright fraudulent tea circulated for decades before public pressure and investigative exposure forced governments to act. The pattern should feel familiar by now, because it is the same pattern that shaped tea's entire history, an industry allowed to police itself until the human cost became too visible, too documented, or too politically embarrassing to ignore. At which point regulation followed reluctantly behind scandal rather than preceding it. If you are noticing that tea's history is one long cycle of concealment followed by exposure, you are exactly right, and if you want to keep tracing that cycle all the way into the modern industry, now is a good moment to subscribe, because the story only gets stranger from here. The same institutions that had marketed tea as a symbol of purity and national comfort were, simultaneously, selling a product frequently cut with inferior substitutes, and the same plantation system celebrated in postcards of misty green hills was still, deep into the industrial era, relying on labor conditions that inspection reports described as dangerously inadequate. Regulation, when it finally came, addressed the adulteration far more swiftly than it addressed the labor. Purity could be tested in a laboratory. Exploitation happening thousands of miles away, on plantations owned by politically connected companies, proved far more resistant to reform. By the late 19th century, the plant that Robert Fortune had smuggled out of China was no longer confined to Assam. Colonial planners, hungry to spread the profits and the risk of tea cultivation across their empire, transplanted the crop into new soil entirely, and the plant proved astonishingly adaptable. In the highlands of Ceylon, coffee blight had wiped out an entire agricultural economy in the 1870s, and desperate planters pivoted to tea almost overnight, turning the island into one of the world's dominant exporters within a generation. Half a world away, in the East African highlands of Kenya, colonial administrators discovered that the elevation, rainfall, and volcanic soil created near ideal growing conditions. And by the 20th century, a plantation system, modelled directly on the Assam blueprint, had taken root there too, complete with the same reliance on cheap labour and foreign ownership of the land producing the crop. Tea, once a jealously guarded secret of the Chinese state, was now grown on 4 continents, controlled largely by companies and governments that had never cultivated a single leaf of it themselves a century before. The industry that had begun with imperial theft had metastasized into a genuinely global one, and the countries doing the growing were rarely the countries doing the profiting. That imbalance, dressed up in different language, persists in the industry today. Kenya is now among the largest tea exporters on earth. Sri Lanka's economy remains deeply tied to the crop planted in the wreckage of its coffee industry. India, the site of fortune's stolen seedlings, is one of the largest tea producers and consumers in the world. And China, the plant's original home, the empire that tried to keep it secret, tax it, monopolize it, and eventually watched it get stolen out from under its own borders, remains a tea powerhouse too, producing and consuming staggering quantities of the very leaf it once controlled entirely on its own terms. Think about that for a second. A plant discovered, according to legend, by an emperor testing poisons in his garden, ended up circling the globe through theft, addiction, war, and forced labor, only to become so thoroughly normalized that almost nobody sipping it today gives any of that history a second thought. Which brings us back to where we started. 2 billion cups a day, poured in London kitchens, Nairobi markets, Kolkata train platforms, and American coffee shops that stock it almost as an afterthought. Every one of those cups carries, whether anyone tastes it or not, the residue of Lin Zexu's dissolved opium chests, the false papers of a Scottish botanist posing as a mandarin, the silver that drained out of Britain, and the blood that was spilled getting it back, and the unpaid, uncounted labour of workers on plantations who never saw a fraction of the wealth their leaves generated. It is easy to look at a tea bag and see nothing but hot water and habit. It is much harder, once you know the history, to see it as anything less than a 5,000-year-old weapon of empire that people now drink for comfort. The world did not just develop a taste for tea. Empires built themselves on it. Wars were fought over it, and millions of ordinary lives were spent producing it. One leaf, one war, and one empire at a time.